She had buried her mother with her own small hands, because there was no one else to do it. She had slept in doorways, begged no one, stolen nothing, and given away her last piece of bread more times than she could count, because a dying woman's final words had asked her to. She never once believed she was anyone's daughter but a baker's. She had no idea that the coldest king in Blackthorn's history was about to stop his carriage in the middle of a rainstorm, take one bite of her bread, and feel his heart remember how to break. Before we begin, if this story finds its way into your chest the way it found its way into mine, subscribe, hit like, and tell me where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Now let's go back to where it all started, with a girl, a basket of bread, and a king who thought he had nothing left to lose. The rain had not stopped in 3 days, and Arya Bennett had stopped waiting for it to. She stood beneath the broken awning of a shuttered bakery on the edge of the Royal Avenue, a basket of warm bread pressed to her chest like something precious enough to shield with her whole body. Steam rose faintly from beneath the cloth covering the loaves, curling upward before the cold swallowed it. Her dress, too thin for the weather, too small for how much she'd grown this past year, clung to her shoulders, soaked through at the collar. She was 9 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that the cold didn't care how young you were. "Fresh bread," she called, her voice small against the noise of carriage wheels and rain. "Baked this morning." A woman in an emerald coat glanced at the basket, wrinkled her nose, and hurried past beneath an umbrella held by a servant. A merchant elbowed his way by without looking at her at all. A city guard posted at the mouth of the Royal Avenue barked at her to move along. This street wasn't for beggars. "I'm not begging," Arya said quietly. "I'm selling." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence told her everything about what he thought the difference was. She stepped back into the shelter of the awning anyway, because moving along meant nowhere warmer, nowhere drier, just further from the one street where anyone with coin might actually stop. A small boy, no older than 6, darted close to her basket, thin fingers reaching for a loaf before he could stop himself. He froze the second he realized he'd been seen, eyes wide with the particular fear of a child who expected to be struck. Arya didn't raise her voice. She didn't even frown. She lifted the cloth higher and pressed 2 loaves into his hands instead of 1. "Take this to your mother too," she said. "Tell her it's still warm." The boy stared at her, like she'd spoken a different language, then ran, clutching the bread against his chest, the way Arya clutched her basket, like it was the only warm thing left in the world. An old woman sitting nearby, wrapped in a moth-eaten shawl, shook her head slowly. "You'll starve giving it away like that, child." "My mother used to say," Arya answered, settling back against the wall, "that the world can take your home, your food, even your name, but it can't take your kindness unless you hand it over yourself." She looked down at the basket, at the 4 loaves left. "I'm not handing mine over." The old woman said nothing more, but her eyes were wet when she looked away. Arya didn't notice. She was watching the street, the way she always did without meaning to, for a flash of silver hair in a crowd, for a man her mother used to describe in half-finished sentences before catching herself and going quiet. She never told Arya his name, only that he existed, only that once, a long time ago, he had loved them. Across the square, a black carriage bearing the royal crest slowed at the crossing, its wheels hissing against wet stone. Inside, King Cale Ravenshade sat in silence, exactly as he had for the better part of the last decade. Spine straight, jaw set, a man built more out of restraint than blood. 438 years old, feared across every province in Blackthorn Kingdom. Court scribes called him untouchable, immovable, a ruler carved from winter itself. None of them knew about the pendant locked in his private drawer. None of them knew he had turned down 11 noble matches in 10 years, not out of pride, but because some quiet, stubborn part of him still believed his queen hadn't left him. Not really. Not by choice. "Your Majesty," his aide said from the seat across from him. "The council is already seated." "We're late." Cale said nothing. He was looking out the carriage window at nothing in particular, at rain, at strangers, at a city that had long since stopped surprising him. Then he saw her, a small girl beneath a broken awning, soaked to the bone, offering bread to people who wouldn't meet her eyes, and smiling anyway. Not the practiced smile of someone begging for coin, something quieter, something that looked, absurdly, like peace. He didn't know why he couldn't look away. "Sir, we really must." "Wait." The aide fell silent, startled. Cale hadn't said that word, hadn't hesitated on anything, and longer than the man had served him. The carriage rolled another few feet forward, and for one strange moment, Cale felt something shift low in his chest, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 10 years. He told himself it was nothing, a tired mind, a long decade. But his hand was already reaching for the door. "Driver," he said quietly, "stop here." The wheels ground to a halt against the wet stone, and somewhere behind him, his aide exhaled a slow, disbelieving breath. Because the King of Blackthorn had just done something none of them had seen him do in 10 long years. He had stopped for someone. The carriage door swung open before Arya could step back, and for one terrified moment she thought she'd done something wrong. The King of Blackthorn was not supposed to stop. Not for her. Not for anyone standing on this side of the avenue. She'd heard the stories, the same ones every child in the city grew up whispering after dark, about the ancient vampire ruler whose temper could freeze a man's blood before his blade ever touched him. She should have run. Instead, her feet stayed rooted to the wet stone and her arms tightened instinctively around her basket, as if warm bread could somehow shield her from a king. "Forgive me," she said quickly, dropping into an unpracticed, clumsy bow. "I didn't mean to block the road, Your Majesty. I'll move." "You didn't block anything." His voice was low, quieter than she expected. "Not unkind, just tired, in a way that didn't match the crown or the crest stitched into his carriage door." Arya hesitated, then lifted the cloth over her basket, revealing the last 4 loaves, still faintly steaming despite the rain. "Would you like to buy some bread, sir? It's fresh. I baked it myself before sunrise." For a long moment, Cale said nothing. He simply studied her, the soaped tangle of brown hair, the too thin coat, the quiet dignity in the way she held herself despite clearly having nothing. It was such a small, unremarkable scene, a hungry child selling bread in the rain. His kingdom was full of them. And yet something about her stillness held him in place. "1 loaf," he said finally. She smiled, small, grateful, startled, and pulled Ilzo free, wrapping it carefully in cloth before passing it up to him. Their fingers brushed for half a second. Hers were freezing. He didn't hand her coin right away. He was already lifting the bread toward his face, and the scent hit him before he understood why it mattered. Butter, rosemary, a faint trace of honey beneath the crust. His hand stopped moving. It couldn't be. He told himself it was nothing. Bread was bread, and rosemary was common enough in any kitchen in Blackthorn. But some old instinct, buried under a decade of discipline, refused to let the thought go. He broke the loaf open, and steam rose from the center, and before he could stop himself, he'd taken a bite. The world tilted. It wasn't similar to Alara's bread. It was Alara's bread. The exact recipe she used to make in the royal kitchens on cold mornings, the one she refused to write down. The one she said she'd only ever teach to someone she loved enough to trust with it. He remembered standing in that kitchen doorway, watching her flour-dusted hands work the dough, laughing at something the palace cook had said, glancing up to catch him staring and pretending she hadn't noticed. No servant knew this recipe. No noble had ever tasted it. Alara had made certain of that. So how did a homeless child selling bread on a street corner know it exactly? Cale's hand trembled slightly around the loaf. He looked at the girl again, really looked at her this time, and forced his voice to stay steady. "Who taught you to make this?" "My mother," Arya said simply, pulling her damp shawl tighter around her shoulders, unaware that her answer had just cracked something open in the man in front of her. "What was her name?" There was a pause. The kind that stretches longer than it should, fade only by rain hitting stone and distant carriage wheels. "Alara." The name landed like a blade between his ribs. For 10 years, Cale Ravenshade had trained himself not to react to grief in public. He had stood before councils, addressed uprisings, executed traitors, all without his expression shifting. But hearing that single word, spoken so plainly by a child who had no idea what it meant, undid 10 years of careful control in the space of a heartbeat. He couldn't speak. Arya, mistaking his silence for something else, disappointment perhaps, or disapproval, glanced down at the bread in his hands, worried she'd somehow failed him. "I'm sorry if it's not good enough for the palace, sir. I know it's not fancy." She looked up as she said it, and Cale saw her eyes. Violet, not brown, not gray, not some trick of the storm light. Violet, the exact shade he had fallen asleep memorizing on countless nights beside his wife, the exact shade he had watched fill with tears on their wedding day. The exact shade that had looked up at him from a bundle of blankets the night their daughter was born. The street disappeared. The carriage, the rain, the guards, the crowd, all of it fell away, and for one suspended moment, Cale was standing in the royal kitchens again, watching Alara laugh with flour on her cheek. Then he was at their wedding, spinning her beneath candlelight, her violet eyes bright with a joy he hadn't felt from anyone since. Then he was holding a newborn girl wrapped in white, and Alara was crying, and she was smiling up at him, and she was saying his name. He couldn't breathe. "Sir?" Arya's small voice cut through the memory, uncertain now, frightened by his stillness. "Are you all right?" He said nothing. He couldn't. Thinking she had upset him somehow, that perhaps the bread truly hadn't pleased him, or that she had overstepped by speaking so freely to a king, Arya quickly reached into her basket and pulled out another loaf, pressing it toward him without waiting for coin. "Please, take this one too. No charge. I'm sorry if I said something wrong." Cale stared at the bread in her outstretched hands, and at the girl offering it with the same quiet, unshakable kindness that had once made him fall in love with her mother. He still could not speak. From the shadow of a second carriage stopped further down the avenue. A pair of narrowed eyes watched the entire exchange unfold. Cedric Thornvale had recognized the girl instantly. The tangled brown hair, the small frame, features he'd spent 10 years hoping the world would forget existed. Then his gaze dropped to the thin silver chain visible at her collar, and to the crest engraved upon the pendant hanging from it. The color drained from his face. No, he thought. No, this cannot be happening. For the first time in a decade, Cedric Thornvale felt something he had long forgotten how to feel. Fear. Cedric Thornvale did not move until the royal carriage pulled away from the curb, its wheels hissing through the rain-slick avenue, carrying Cale back toward the palace in a silence Cedric could sense even from a distance. Only then did he step down from his own carriage, waving off his driver's questions, and follow the girl on foot. He kept to the shadows the way he had learned to do a decade ago. Quietly, patiently, invisibly, Arya wound her way through the narrow side streets behind the market square, unaware that a man who had spent 10 years burying her existence was now only a few dozen paces behind her. He watched her stop to give half a loaf to a shivering old man sleeping in a doorway. He watched her greet a fruit seller by name. He watched her smile at strangers who didn't deserve it, in a city that had never once been kind to her. Just like her mother, Cedric thought bitterly. Impossible not to notice. Impossible to erase. He had believed, for 10 years, that he'd succeeded. The memories came whether he wanted them or not. 10 years earlier, Cedric Thornvale had stood in the same city as the most trusted advisor to the throne, the man Cale consulted before any decision, the man the court believed incapable of betrayal. He had told himself, in the beginning, that his reasons were noble. A human queen, a half-vampire heir, 2 truths that threatened to unravel 4 centuries of bloodline law, 4 centuries of order. Cedric had sworn to protect. It was never personal, he told himself. Even now, it was necessary. He remembered forging the first letter in his private study, copying Alara's handwriting from old correspondence until his hand ached, crafting words cold enough to convince Cale his queen had grown tired of palace life, tired of him, tired of a marriage that had never truly been accepted by the court. He remembered bribing the 2 servants closest to Alara, paying them enough gold to guarantee their silence for a lifetime. He remembered standing in Alara's private chambers, the night everything changed, telling her plainly what would happen to her newborn daughter if she did not disappear quietly and never return. She had begged him. He remembered that too, though he tried not to. "Please," she had said, cradling Arya against her chest. "She's innocent. She's done nothing." "She's a threat the moment she's born," Cedric had answered. "Leave tonight, and she lives. Stay. And I promise you, neither of you will see morning." Alara had left before dawn, and Cedric had spent the following weeks perfecting the story the entire kingdom eventually believed, that the queen had abandoned her husband and vanished into the world by choice. unable to bear the weight of the crown. Cale had mourned her for 10 years, believing a lie. Cedric built with his own hands, and now, impossibly, unbearably, her daughter was standing 3 streets away, offering free bread to a king who had just tasted her mother's recipe on his tongue. Cedric's hands were shaking by the time he reached his own carriage again. This cannot happen. Not now. Not after everything. If Cale discovered the truth, if he connected the eyes, the recipe, the age, the resemblance, 10 years of careful lies would collapse in a single afternoon, and Cedric Thornvale would not survive what came after. He climbed inside, drew the curtain, and called for his most trusted man, a quiet, efficient soldier who had handled uncomfortable matters for Cedric before, matters that never appeared in any official record. "There is a girl," Cedric said, his voice low and controlled despite the panic clawing beneath his ribs. 9 years old. Brown hair. She sells bread near the Royal Avenue. Find out where she sleeps. And once we find her, my lord? Cedric closed his eyes briefly as though the next words cost him something, though not enough to stop him from saying them. She does not see morning. The soldier bowed without question and disappeared into the rain. At the palace, Cale sat through the remainder of the council meeting without hearing a single word spoken. Reports on border taxation, grain shortages, a minor uprising in the southern province, all of it moved past him like distant noise. His mind kept returning to a small, damp street corner, to violet eyes he hadn't seen in 10 years, to the taste of bread that should not exist anywhere in this kingdom except in his own memory. Coincidence, he told himself. It has to be coincidence. But 4 centuries of instinct told him otherwise, and Cale had learned long ago never to ignore that particular feeling. When the meeting finally ended, he did not return to his private chambers. Instead, he summoned Rowan Ashcroft, the one man in the palace whose loyalty had never once wavered, whose judgment Cale trusted above every noble seated at that council table. "I need you to find someone," Cale said quietly, once they were alone. "A child. Brown hair, violet eyes, no older than 9. She sells bread near the Royal Avenue, close to the old bakery district." Rowan studied him carefully. In all his years serving the crown, he had never seen the king ask about a commoner, let alone with this particular tightness in his voice. "May I ask why, your majesty?" Cale hesitated, the words catching somewhere behind years of restraint. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I need to know everything about her. Where she lives, who her mother was. Everything." Rowan bowed, and though he didn't fully understand the weight behind the request, he recognized something in Cale's expression he hadn't seen in a decade. The smallest, most fragile flicker of hope. "I'll leave within the hour." By the time night fell over Blackthorn City, 2 very different men were searching for the same little girl for 2 very different reasons. One determined to protect her. The other determined to erase her before the truth could surface. Neither of them reached her first. In the narrow alley behind the abandoned bakery where Arya slept most nights, 2 shadows moved quietly along the rooftops, watching a thin trail of candlelight flicker behind a cracked window. One of them turned to the other and nodded once. They had found her. Arya woke before the sun, the way she always did, to the sound of rain tapping against the cracked window pane of the abandoned bakery she called home. The building had been empty for years, its old ovens cold, its shelves stripped bare by looters long before Arya ever found it. But she had learned to love it anyway. The back room still smelled faintly of yeast and flour if she pressed her face close enough to the walls. It was dry, mostly. It was hers. She lit a small candle stub, careful to shield the flame from the draft slipping through the broken shutters, and began kneading dough in the dim light, just as her mother had taught her. "Fold it gently," Ilaria used to say, guiding Arya's small hands over the dough when she was barely old enough to reach the table. "Bread rises best when it's made with patience, not anger." Arya worked in silence, the rhythm of it as familiar as breathing. By the time the first gray light crept through the window, 4 fresh loaves sat cooling on the old counter, and Arya allowed herself a small, tired smile. Before heading out to sell, she stopped at Mrs. Aldridge's door, an elderly widow 2 streets over who had taken ill weeks earlier and rarely left her bed. Arya knocked softly, waited, then let herself in when no answer came, setting a warm loaf in a small jar of broth beside the woman's bed. "You didn't have to," Mrs. Aldridge murmured weakly, eyes fluttering open. I know, Arya said simply, tucking the blanket higher around the woman's shoulders. I wanted to. It was a phrase she said often to many people, and meant every time. That evening, after another long day on the streets, after the merchant who sneered at her basket, after the guard who ordered her away from the Royal Avenue, after the small boy she'd fed 2 mornings before ran up just to thank her, Arya returned to the bakery with only 1 loaf left, unsold, tucked it away for tomorrow's breakfast, and settled onto her thin blanket with her mother's old notebook. The leather cover was worn soft from years of handling. Most of the pages held nothing but recipes: bread, pies, small remedies for coughs and fevers, but a few scattered entries were different. Fragments. Half-finished thoughts her mother had never explained. He had silver hair. One line read, "Ink faded almost to nothing, and eyes that softened only for me. I wonder sometimes if he ever thinks of us." Arya had read the line 100 times and understood it no better now than she had the first. "Who was he, Mama?" she whispered to the empty room, the way she often did when the silence grew too heavy to hold alone. Her mother had spoken of him only rarely, always with the same distant sadness. A brave man, silver-haired, who had loved her once in a life Arya had never been allowed to know. Alara had never given him a name, only love and loss, folded into a handful of sentences Arya had memorized without meaning to. She closed the notebook gently and blew out the candle, unaware that barely a mile away, the very man her mother had never named was standing at his window, unable to stop thinking about her. She woke to the sound of the door splintering. Arya bolted upright, heart slamming against her ribs, as 3 shadowed figures forced their way into the bakery's front room, blades already drawn, moonlight glinting off steel through the broken window. She had no time to scream, no time to run. The nearest assassin lunged toward her corner of the room and was thrown backward through the door frame by a blur of motion that moved faster than Arya's eyes could follow. "Stay down," a voice commanded, low and urgent. Arya pressed herself against the wall, trembling, as Captain Rowan Ashcroft placed himself between her and the 3 attackers, sword already drawn, his stance calm despite the chaos exploding around him. The fight that followed filled the narrow street outside with the ring of clashing steel. Rowan moved with the discipline of a man who had trained his entire life for exactly this kind of moment, deflecting one blade, driving his shoulder into a second attacker, sending him sprawling into a stack of broken crates. The 3rd assassin circled wide, searching for an opening, but Rowan never let his guard fall, never let his attention drift from the trembling child crouched in the doorway behind him. "Run to the well and hide," he called to her, blocking another strike. Now, Arya didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs refused to obey her, frozen by terror she'd never known before. Rowan disarmed the second attacker with a sharp twist of his blade, sending the man's sword clattering across wet stone, then turned in time to catch the 3rd assassin's strike on his own weapon, forcing him backward with a burst of strength that ended the fight in a single decisive movement. The 2 remaining attackers fled into the darkness, disappearing between buildings before Rowan could pursue. Silence fell over the street, broken only by rain and Arya's uneven breathing. Rowan sheathed his sword and turned to her slowly, kneeling so he wasn't towering over her. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. Arya shook her head, still shaking, tears finally slipping free now that the danger had passed. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to help me." "I know," Rowan said, echoing without realizing it the very words she so often gave to others. "I wanted to." Arya studied him for a long moment. His kind eyes, his steady hands, the way he'd fought without hesitation for a girl he'd never met, then reached behind her, pulled her last remaining loaf from its cloth, and offered it to him. "It's not much," she said softly, "but it's warm." Rowan stared at the bread in her small hands, and for one of the very few times in his disciplined life, found himself utterly speechless. Half a mile away, one assassin stumbled through the rain-soaked alleys of Blackthorn City, clutching a wound along his side, moving as quickly as his injury allowed. He did not stop running until he reached Cedric Thornvale's private study, bursting through the door breathless and pale. "My lord," he gasped, "she's alive. The girl is alive and she's protected." The captain of the guard himself intervened. Cedric rose slowly from his chair, his face draining of color in the candlelight. "Rowan," he whispered, Somewhere in the palace, the truth had just taken its first step toward the light, and Cedric Thornvale understood with sudden, cold certainty that he was running out of time. Rowan's report reached Cale before sunrise. He listened in silence as the captain recounted the attack. The 3 armed men, the forced entry, the girl left trembling but unharmed, and by the time Rowan finished speaking, Cale's hands had curled into fists at his sides. "Someone wants her dead," Cale said quietly. "A homeless child who sells bread on a street corner. Someone wants her dead. I don't have an explanation, Your Majesty, but I intend to find one." "So do I." He did not send guards. He did not summon the girl to the palace, where 100 watching eyes would ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. Instead, that afternoon, Cale did something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. He went to her himself, alone, dressed in a plain traveling cloak that hid the crest stitched into his collar. He found her sweeping broken glass from the bakery's front room, the damage from the attack still scattered across the floor. "You shouldn't be here without protection," he said from the doorway. Arya startled, nearly dropping the broom, then relaxed slightly when she recognized him. "You're the man who bought my bread yesterday." "I am. Are you here to buy more?" Despite everything pressing on his mind, the corner of Cale's mouth almost lifted. Something like that. He stayed longer than he intended. He helped her clear the broken glass without being asked, working in silence beside her while rain tapped steadily against the cracked roof. She talked more than he expected, not out of nervousness, but because silence had never seemed to suit her the way it suited him. She told him about Mrs. Beda, Aldridge down the street, about the boy who'd tried to steal bread and ended up with 2 loaves instead, about the notebook full of her mother's recipes that she still couldn't bring herself to finish reading in one sitting. Cale listened to all of it, and with every small detail, something inside him twisted tighter. She held her spoon the exact way Alara used to, angled slightly to the left. She tilted her head when she was thinking, the same small gesture Alara made 1,000 times across a decade of marriage. She hummed without noticing while she worked, a tune Cale hadn't heard in 10 years. One Alara used to sing in the royal kitchens on quiet mornings. Coincidence, he told himself again, though the word felt thinner every time he reached for it. "You're staring," Arya said, glancing up at him. "Forgive me," Cale said quietly. "You remind me of someone. Someone you miss? Someone you miss?" The question landed harder than she could have known. "Very much." Later, as the light began to fade, Arya climbed onto an overturned crate to reach a shelf above the old ovens, reaching for a tin box she kept there. Her foot slipped on the damp wood, and she fell before she could catch herself. Cale moved without thinking, closing the distance in an instant, catching her before she struck the floor. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling with her still in his arms. "I'm fine," she said, slightly breathless, "just clumsy." She stopped. So did he. In the fall, her collar had shifted, and there, resting against her collarbone, where it always hung hidden beneath her clothes, was a small silver pendant on a thin chain. Cale's entire body went still. "Where did you get that?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. Arya's hand went instinctively to the pendant, covering it. "It was my mother's. She gave it to me before she died. She said I should never take it off, no matter what." "May I see it?" Something in his tone made her hesitate, but she nodded slowly, lifting the chain over her head and placing it carefully in his open palm. Cale's hands began to shake the moment the pendant touched his skin. He knew this piece. He knew every curve of the engraving, every detail of the royal crest worked into the silver because he had commissioned it himself from the finest craftsman in Blackthorn nearly 10 years ago, a gift for Alara, made in secret, delivered only weeks before their daughter was born. He remembered fastening it around her neck himself, remembered her laughing softly and calling it too fine for a queen who spends her mornings covered in flour. No one else in the kingdom possessed one like it. No copy existed. He had made certain of that. "Where?" he said again, his voice barely holding steady. "Did your mother get this?" "I don't know," Arya admitted, watching him carefully now, sensing the shift in the air around them. "She never said, only that it was important, that I should keep it safe." Cale turned the pendant over with trembling fingers, and that was when he noticed it, a nearly invisible seam along the back edge, so fine it would escape most eyes entirely. He pressed gently at the edge, and the pendant shifted slightly, revealing the faint outline of a hidden compartment. His breath caught. He tried to open it, pressing at every angle, searching for a latch, a hinge, anything, but the compartment held firm, sealed by some mechanism he couldn't identify. "It's locked," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Locked." Arya leaned closer, startled. "I never knew there was anything inside." Cale said nothing for a long moment, staring down at the silver in his palm as though it might answer the questions clawing through his chest if he only looked hard enough. Wedding memories surfaced unbidden. Alara's hands closing this very clasp around her own neck, laughing, promising she would carry it always, wherever life took her. Wherever life took her. His throat tightened. "Sir?" Arya's voice was quiet, uncertain, pulling him back. "Is something wrong?" Cale closed his fingers gently around the pendant, then looked up at her, at violet eyes, at a face he could no longer pretend not to recognize, and felt something ancient and long buried rise up inside him, somewhere between grief and impossible hope. "Only Alara knew how to open this," he whispered. The words left him before he understood their weight. "Only Alara knew how to open this," Cale whispered again, staring at the pendant as though it might dissolve in his hand. Arya watched him carefully, her earlier caution giving way to something gentler. Concern, plain and instinctive, the same kindness she offered strangers on street corners now turned toward the trembling man kneeling in front of her. "You knew her," she said quietly. It wasn't a question this time. Cale couldn't answer. His fingers moved over the pendant's hidden seam again, and this time, perhaps guided by memory more than mechanism, he pressed his thumb against the exact spot Alara had shown him once, laughing, telling him it was a secret meant only for the two of them. The compartment clicked open. A tiny folded letter sat inside, the paper yellowed and brittle with age, ink faded but still legible. Cale's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped it. "What is it?" Arya asked softly. He didn't answer. He unfolded the letter with the same reverence he might have shown the crown itself, and Alara's handwriting, unmistakable, achingly familiar, filled the page. "My love, if you are reading this, then somehow, against everything I feared, our daughter has found her way back to you. I pray she is safe. I pray you are well. I pray you have not spent these years believing what Cedric wanted you to believe. I never left you. I need you to know that above everything else, I never stopped loving you, not for a single day." Cale's breath caught. He kept reading, and with every line, 10 years of grief and certainty began collapsing beneath him. "Cedric came to me the night after our daughter was born. He told me plainly what would happen to her if I stayed, that a half-human heir threatened everything he believed the crown must protect, and that he would see her removed from this world before he allowed her to inherit it. I did not believe threats came easily to him until I saw his eyes. He meant every word. I ran to protect her, not because I stopped loving you, but because I loved her too much to risk losing her. I tried to reach you twice in those first years. Letters, messengers, one desperate attempt through an old friend at court, but Cedric intercepted every effort before it reached you. I began to understand, eventually, that I could not fight him and keep her safe at the same time, so I chose her safety. I would choose it again." Cale's vision blurred. He had to stop, blinking hard before he could continue. "I grew sick 2 years ago. The healers in this city could do little for me, and I have made peace with what is coming. My only fear is for Arya, that she will be alone, that she will never know who she truly is, that she will grow up believing herself unwanted rather than desperately, endlessly loved. I have given her everything I have left to give, my recipes, my mother's pendant, and the truth, folded small enough to carry against her heart until someone finally recognizes it. If you are holding this letter, then somehow, some way, she found you. Please, forgive me for the years I couldn't give her a father. Forgive me for the years I couldn't give you a daughter. And please, whatever you do, protect her from the man who took 10 years of our lives from us. I loved you until my very last breath, Cale. I love you still. Alara." The letter fell from Cale's hands. For 438 years, King Cale Ravenshade had built himself into something the kingdom called untouchable, a ruler who did not weep, did not falter, did not break beneath any weight placed upon him. He had buried grief so deep beneath duty that even he had begun to believe it no longer existed. It existed. It broke free of him now in a single shattering breath, and the vampire king of Blackthorn, feared across every province, unmoved by war, unmoved by betrayal, unmoved by centuries of loss, collapsed to his knees on the floor of an abandoned bakery and wept. Arya didn't understand everything unfolding in front of her. She didn't yet know the shape of the truth pressing down on this stranger who had bought her bread, who had followed her home, who now knelt shaking on the floor of the only home she'd ever known. But she understood grief. She had lived inside it for 2 years. She knelt beside him, small and uncertain, and rested her hand gently against his shoulder. The same simple comfort she offered anyone who wept in front of her, without asking why. "It's all right," she whispered, though she didn't know what she was comforting him for. "Whatever it is, it's all right." Cale lifted his head, tears still streaking down a face that hadn't shown weakness in centuries, and looked at her, truly looked at her. Violet eyes meeting violet eyes. 10 years of searching finally arriving somewhere he never let himself believe he'd reach. "Arya," he said, his voice breaking entirely around her name. Neither of them noticed Rowan standing quietly in the doorway, having arrived moments earlier to check on them both, now frozen in place by the scene before him. He didn't understand the letter. He didn't understand the pendant, but he understood, with sudden and total certainty, exactly who was kneeling in front of the King of Blackthorn. Without a word, without waiting for confirmation he didn't need, Rowan lowered himself to one knee before the little bread seller of Blackthorn City. Arya turned to him, startled, uncertain why a captain of the royal guard would kneel before her. Rowan said nothing. He simply bowed his head, silent and certain, honoring a truth none of them had spoken aloud yet. Miles away, in a private study lit only by a single guttering candle, Cedric Thornvale sat alone with a map of the palace spread across his desk, his expression cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy. If the truth could no longer be buried, then the throne itself would have to change hands before anyone had the chance to speak it. He reached for a quill and began writing the names of every guard, noble, and soldier still loyal enough to help him end this before dawn. The palace had not seen a child brought through its front gates in a decade, and by the time Cale's carriage rolled to a stop in the grand courtyard, half the household staff had already gathered at the windows to watch. Arya stepped down from the carriage, clutching the edge of her worn shawl, staring up at towers she'd only ever seen from a distance. Gray stone stretching toward a sky heavy with clouds, gargoyles perched along every ledge, banners bearing the royal crest snapping in the wind. "It's so big," she whispered. Cale, standing beside her, allowed himself the smallest fraction of a smile. "You'll get used to it." She didn't look convinced. Neither, judging by the whispers already spreading through the corridors, did anyone else. By evening, the entire court had heard the story in a dozen conflicting versions. A peasant girl claiming royal blood, a forged letter, a pendant no one could verify, a king suddenly insisting a homeless bread seller was his long-lost daughter. Some servants believed instantly, moved by the resemblance alone. Others dismissed it as grief finally breaking something loose in a man who had mourned too long without healing. The nobility was far less forgiving. "A half-human heir," spat Duke Alaric Voss, pacing before the assembled council the following morning, his voice rising with barely restrained fury. "Your Majesty, I understand grief clouds judgment, but surely you cannot intend to seat a street child." "I have not asked for your opinion on her blood," Cale said evenly, though the chill in his voice silenced the room instantly. "I asked for your loyalty to the crown. If that loyalty depends on the purity of who sits beside me, perhaps it was never loyalty at all." Boss said nothing further, though his expression made clear the matter was far from settled in his mind. Not every noble reacted with hostility. A handful, mostly older families who remembered Alara fondly, who had watched Cale's decade of quiet grief up close, welcomed the news with something closer to relief. If Alara's daughter had truly survived, perhaps some fragment of the woman the kingdom had loved might yet remain. Outside the palace walls, the city split just as sharply. In the poorer districts, where Arya had spent years handing out bread to strangers, the news spread like wildfire and was met with genuine joy. The bread girl, the kind one, was the lost princess. Of course she was. Who else could kindness like that possibly belong to? In wealthier quarters, the reaction ran colder. Some feared instability, others feared a war of succession, a few quietly feared exactly what Cedric had always feared, that a mixed bloodline sitting on Blackthorn's throne might weaken everything the kingdom had built its power upon. Rumors bred rumors. By nightfall, no one in Blackthorn City hadn't heard some version of the story, true or otherwise. While the court argued and the city whispered, Cale worked. He summoned every servant who had worked in the palace 10 years earlier, one by one, in private. Most had long since scattered to other households or retired into quiet obscurity, but Cale tracked down each of them personally, patient in a way the court rarely saw from him. The first breakthrough came from an elderly seamstress named Myrna, who had once mended Alara's gowns. I always wondered, she admitted, hands trembling slightly as she spoke, why the queen's belongings vanished so quickly after she disappeared. Lord Thornvale ordered her chambers cleared within a day. I thought it strange even then, but no one questioned him. No one dared. A former stable hand came forward next, recalling a night 10 years past, when he'd been paid an unusual sum to say nothing about a carriage he'd seen leaving the palace grounds after midnight. Alara's carriage, though he hadn't understood the significance until years later. Then came the forgotten records. Ledgers buried in the palace archive, showing payments made from Cedric's private accounts to servants long dismissed, gold with no official explanation attached. A junior scribe, nervous and apologetic, finally admitted he'd once been ordered to alter travel logs from that same period, erasing any mention of Alara's movements in the weeks before her disappearance. Piece by piece, the conspiracy Cedric had spent 10 years burying began rising back to the surface. Cale read each testimony, each ledger, each faded record with the same controlled intensity he brought to every threat against his kingdom. Except this threat was personal in a way nothing else had ever been. Cedric Thornvale felt the walls closing in long before anyone confronted him directly. He heard about the seamstress. He heard about the stable hand. He heard, with mounting horror, that the scribe had spoken as well. Servants who had stayed silent out of fear or gold for 10 years were suddenly finding their courage, one after another, and Cedric understood with cold clarity that testimony alone might soon be enough to end him. He could not allow it to reach that point. That night, in the privacy of his chambers, he met with the last remaining loyalists still bound to him by fear or debt. A small handful of guards a disgraced captain dismissed years earlier for corruption. 2 nobles who stood to lose everything if a half-human heir claimed the succession. This ends tonight, Cedric told them quietly, before the girl's testimony reaches the full council, before Cale gathers enough to move against me formally. And the girl herself? One of the guards asked. Cedric's expression didn't waver. She does not survive the night, nor does anyone who stands between us and her. They dispersed into the palace shadows one by one, each carrying instructions memorized rather than written, leaving no trace that could later be traced back to the man who issued them. Inside the palace, Arya sat curled in an unfamiliar guest chamber, staring out at the darkened courtyard below, still unable to believe any of this was real. Cale had just stepped into the hallway to speak with Rowan, his voice low and urgent through the door, when every torch and lantern along the corridor guttered out at once. The entire palace plunged into darkness. The darkness lasted only a heartbeat before the first blade struck the corridor wall beside Cale's head. He moved on instinct alone, catching the attacker's wrist mid-strike and driving him backward into the stone with enough force to crack it. Shouts erupted through the black corridors. Guards scrambling for torches, steel ringing against steel. Chaos spreading through the palace like fire through dry grass. Arya! Rowan's voice cut through the noise, already moving toward her chamber before Cale could give the order. Cale didn't wait to see whether Rowan reached her in time. He turned to face the 2 remaining attackers pressing toward him through the dark, and something ancient stirred beneath his composure, something he rarely allowed the court to witness. His eyes shifted first, darkening to a red deep enough to glow faintly even without torchlight. When the nearest assassin lunged, Cale caught the blade in his bare hand, metal biting into skin that healed as quickly as it tore, and drove the man backward with strength no mortal soldier could hope to match. 438 years of restraint fell away in an instant. He was not merely a king tonight. He was the oldest vampire in Blackthorn Kingdom, and anyone who threatened his daughter was about to learn exactly what that meant. Inside her chamber, Arya pressed herself against the wall as the door burst open, heart hammering until she recognized Rowan's silhouette cutting through the darkness toward her. "Stay behind me," he said, already positioning himself between her and the corridor. 2 assassins appeared in the doorway seconds later, and Rowan met them without hesitation, his blade flashing in the dim moonlight spilling through the window. Arya pressed her hands over her mouth to keep from crying out, watching him fight with the same disciplined precision he'd shown the night he saved her at the bakery. Except here, in the palace, he'd sworn his love to protect his movements, carried something fiercer, more desperate. He disarmed the first attacker with the brutal twist of his blade. The second came at Arya directly, slipping past Rowan's guard for one terrifying instant, and was thrown backward through the window by Chaol, who arrived exactly when it mattered most. His eyes still burning crimson, his expression carved from something far colder than fury. "Are you hurt?" Chaol asked Arya, kneeling briefly beside her. "No," she managed. "But your eyes, later," he said. "Stay with Rowan." He was already moving again, chasing the sound of Cedric's voice echoing from somewhere deeper in the palace. The battle spilled through corridor after corridor, guards loyal to the crown clashing with Cedric's hired soldiers beneath flickering torchlight finally restored by frantic servants. Cal fought with a speed and ferocity the court had only ever heard described in old legends, moving between attackers like something out of nightmare, ending each confrontation before his opponents fully understood the danger they'd walked into. He found Cedric near the western stairwell, half-dressed, a satchel of documents clutched against his chest, clearly attempting to flee the palace before the chaos he'd orchestrated could be traced back to him. "Going somewhere?" Chaol's voice was quiet and far more dangerous for it. Cedric froze at the top of the stairs, satchel slipping slightly in his trembling grip. "Chaol, your majesty, this is a misunderstanding. I can explain." "You've had 10 years to explain," Chaol said, closing the distance between them with unnatural speed. "I'm no longer interested in listening." Cedric didn't resist, as 2 guards seized him moments later. Whatever plans he built to escape had collapsed the instant Chaol's hand closed around his arm. By morning, the palace's great hall stood packed with nobles, servants, and witnesses summoned on Chaol's order. Every person whose testimony had surfaced over the past days, now standing ready to speak in front of the full royal court. Cedric stood at the center of the hall in chains, his composure finally completely broken. One by one, the witnesses spoke. Myrna described the hurried clearing of Alara's chambers. The former stable hand recounted the carriage that left in the dead of night. The scribe admitted, voice shaking, to altering records at Cedric's direct instruction. Then Chaol stepped forward, holding Alara's letter carefully in both hands, and read it aloud to the entire assembled court. Every word of her sacrifice, her flight, her decade of silent protection, her final act of entrusting everything to a daughter she would not live to see grown. By the time he finished, the great hall had fallen into complete, stunned silence. Cedric's legs seemed to give slightly beneath him. 10 years, Chaol said, folding the letter closed. 10 years I mourned a woman who never left me. 10 years. My daughter grew up on the streets of my own city, hungry and alone, while you sat at my side pretending to serve this crown. Cedric said nothing for a long moment. Then finally, something in him broke entirely. I did it to protect the bloodline, he said, voice hollow now, stripped of every excuse he'd carried for a decade. A human queen, a half-vampire heir. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself. He stopped, shaking his head slowly. It doesn't matter what I told myself. I forged the letters. I threatened Ilara. I forced her into hiding. And when her daughter survived, I tried to have her killed rather than let the truth surface. The confession landed across the hall like a physical blow. Gasps rippled through the assembled nobles. Even Cedric's remaining allies looked away, unwilling to be associated with what he'd just admitted before the entire court. Take him to the dungeons, Chaol said quietly. His fate will be decided by full council in accordance with the law he claimed to be protecting. Guards moved forward to escort Cedric away, his head bowed, the weight of 10 years finally irreversibly settling upon him. The hall remained silent long after Cedric disappeared through the doors, every noble and servant present understanding they had just witnessed the collapse of the greatest deception in Blackthorn's history. Cale stood at the center of it all. Alara's letter still held gently in his hand, and turned toward the small figure standing quietly near the edge of the hall. Arya, still dressed in the plain clothes she'd worn from the bakery, watching everything unfold with wide, uncertain eyes. The court watched, breathless, as the King of Blackthorn crossed the hall toward her, and then, in front of every noble, every servant, every witness who had gathered to see justice done, Cale slowly knelt. The entire hall held its breath as Cale knelt before her. Arya stood frozen, uncertain what to do with the king kneeling in front of her, uncertain what any of this meant, until he reached out and gently took her small hands in his. "Arya," he said, his voice steady now in a way it hadn't been since the bakery, since the pendant, since the letter that had broken him open on that dusty floor. "I am your father." The words landed in the silent hall like something sacred. Arya's eyes filled instantly, her hands trembling in his grip. "My father," she repeated, testing the word as though it might dissolve if she said it wrong. "Yes, then why?" Her voice cracked, 10 years of quiet, unspoken loneliness finally rising to the surface. "Why did you never come? Why did you let us live like that? Cold and hungry, if you're the king, if you had everything." "I didn't know," Cale said, and for the first time in centuries, tears slipped freely down his face in front of his entire court. "I was told your mother left me. I searched for her anyway, for 10 years, never believing it. But I never found her because a man I trusted more than anyone buried every trace of where she'd gone. I didn't know you existed until 3 days ago, when a little girl offered me bread in the rain." Arya searched his face, looking for the lie, finding none. "He threatened to kill me," she whispered, understanding settling over her slowly. "That's why she ran." "Yes, and she never stopped loving you." "No," Cale said, his voice breaking entirely now. "She never did. And I am so sorry for every cold night you slept without a home, for every day you went hungry, for every moment you believed no one was looking for you. I would have torn this kingdom apart searching for you both, if I had only known." Arya was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming freely down her own face now, the great hall watching in absolute silence. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her father's neck. "I forgive you," she whispered against his shoulder. "You didn't know. It wasn't your fault." Cale held his daughter for the first time in her 9 years of life, in front of the entire royal court, and wept without any attempt to hide it. 3 days later, they visited Alara's grave together. It sat on a quiet hillside outside the city, marked only by a simple stone Arya had chosen years earlier, too poor then to afford anything grander. Cale knelt before it now, Arya beside him, and unfolded the letter he had carried against his chest every day since finding it. He read the final lines aloud, his voice steady despite the ache behind it. "I loved you until my very last breath, Cale. I love you still." He pressed his palm against the cool stone. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for protecting her when I could not, for giving her 10 years of kindness I should have shared in. I promise you, Alara, she will never be alone again." "Neither will I." Arya knelt and placed a small loaf of warm bread beside the grave, the same offering she'd given strangers her whole life, now given to the mother who had taught her how. "I found him, Mama," she whispered, "just like you said he would." The weeks that followed changed Blackthorn City in ways no one could have predicted. Word of the bread girl's story spread far beyond the palace walls. The homeless princess, the kindness that broke a decade-old conspiracy, the vampire king who wept openly in front of his court for a daughter he never knew he had. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Arya's basket now spoke her name with something close to reverence. Cale, true to his promise, established shelters across the poorer districts of the city, warm beds, hot meals, safe rooms for children with nowhere else to go. Bakeries opened in neighborhoods that had never smelled fresh bread before, staffed by people Arya herself had once fed with her last loaf. Orphan homes rose where abandoned buildings once stood, ensuring no child in Blackthorn would ever again spend a decade sleeping in doorways the way his daughter had. The palace kitchens began opening at dawn, and Arya insisted on baking there herself most mornings. Not as a princess performing charity, but because it was the only thing that still felt entirely her own. Nobles and servants and guards and street children alike lined up for her bread, and no one, not even the coldest duke in the kingdom, complained about eating beside the poor. Kale's rule began to shift too. The kingdom that once feared him for his silence and severity slowly began to see something else beneath the crown. A father, changed by love he'd nearly lost twice, ruling now with a warmth Blackthorn hadn't known in generations. One morning, weeks later, the first light of dawn spilled gold across the palace breakfast room, catching the steam rising from a basket of fresh bread at the center of the table. Arya sat beside her father, tearing a warm loaf in half, and offered him a piece with the same easy smile she'd once given strangers in the rain. "It's better when it's shared," she said. Kale took the bread and for a moment simply looked at her, at Alara's eyes in his daughter's face, at the small habits that still occasionally caught his breath, at the quiet joy that had finally returned to a home that had felt empty for 10 long years. Then his gaze drifted, just briefly, to the empty chair at the end of the table, the one that had sat untouched for a decade, the one he could never quite bring himself to remove. He didn't feel the same ache looking at it now, only gratitude and love that had somehow outlived even the longest night. For the first time in 10 years, the palace felt like a home again. And across Blackthorn Kingdom, people would remember this era not for the fearsome vampire king who once ruled through fear and silence, but for the barefoot bread girl whose kindness restored a broken family, exposed the greatest betrayal the kingdom had ever known, and proved in the end that love, like warm bread shared freely with a stranger, always finds its way home.